chose to talk about domestic violence because it's so pervasive, so common, and it's so important that we recognise it. Every single one of us has an important role to play in addressing concerns when we see them. I've used a variety of different resources, but they all come together with the same message. Domestic violence is not okay, and it's never okay, and we can make a huge difference to victims' lives by recognising it and offering support. The Home Office definition of abuse is any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive or threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. This abuse has many forms, and many victims experience a combination of behaviours. We all understand and recognise physical and sexual abuse. Financial control is often a feature of domestic abuse. Psychological abuse is a form of coercive and controlling behaviour, and it's increasingly recognised. Perpetrators are now much more likely to go to prison. Sally Challen recently had her conviction for murder quashed after her sons realised that the emotional abuse she'd suffered over many years was not properly recognised at the time of her conviction. Morgan McCain said, "It's still domestic violence. They don't have to hit you or choke you or slam your head into a wall in order for it to be domestic violence. They can degrade you, humiliate you, blame you, scream at you, lie to you, cheat on you and withhold finances. Even just control you, and it's still domestic violence." Domestic abuse of older people by family members is an increasing issue as our population ages. This may be a result of the perpetrator being unable to cope with the level of care the victim requires, or the behaviour of the perpetrator may be the result of cognitive impairment. Concern about this needs referral to adult safeguarding procedures, although victims may not want this through fear of exacerbating the abuse or of being placed in residential care. Assessment of capacity is important, but it's hampered if the abuse involves coercive control, as this affects a victim's ability to make decisions freely. This is not an easy situation to resolve. Another significant challenge is managing adolescent to parent violence and abuse. Intervention should focus on supporting the whole family, including the perpetrator. Families often feel deeply ashamed or guilty and are often reluctant to disclose this problem for fear of having their parenting skills judged or having their child criminalised. It's essential that we recognise that abuse is not always visible. Signs include being controlled or isolated, finding it difficult to spend time with friends or family. Cruelty to animals, to pets in the home is common where domestic violence is committed. Constant criticism, jealousy, possessiveness, cruelty to children, demands to meet the abuser's every need, they're all worrying signs. Be wary of a partner who admits to abusing previous partners but insists that it was all their fault. The overarching objective of the Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Act of 2015 is to improve the public sector response in Wales to these crimes. It's aiming to be preventative, protective and supportive. This has introduced healthy relationship education in schools and has brought in the Ask and Act programme. This is a targeted inquiry where specific indicators prompt professionals to ask people questions with the aim of increasing identification of victims. They can then be offered support. We want to create a culture where this is an accepted issue and disclosure leads to positive change. We want to proactively engage with the victims who are vulnerable and hidden at the earliest opportunity, because this changes lives. This really makes a difference. Evidence suggests that most women don't mind being asked when it's explained how common domestic violence is and that it's often hidden. It's important that asking is accompanied by appropriate training and support for staff though, because exposing abuse without having the appropriate knowledge of resources can be dangerous. These are not easy questions to ask. Clinicians may be reluctant because of time constraints, or because they're anxious about causing offence, or they're not confident about what to do to help. It's also important to remember that healthcare professionals may identify personally with abuse, either as victim or as a perpetrator. We must ask though. Domestic violence is a key public health issue and it creates a significant cost burden for the health service. Almost all victims will come into contact with the NHS at some time. We have to understand that domestic abuse has a profound effect on all those who experience it. The pattern of domestic violence is one of escalation, so that means that no level of abuse should be viewed as acceptable or insignificant. Early intervention saves lives and considerable misery and ill health. It's a hidden crime, it's underreported, but it accounts for 1/4 of all violent crime. Unbelievably, it often starts and gets worse in pregnancy. Now, this is important. The idea that women are at least as abusive as men is both wrong and dangerous. 90% of victims are women. Domestic violence can occur in all areas and levels of society, and perpetrators can be well known with high status occupations. Situations which put relationships under strain increase the risk. The abuser frequently says it will never happen again. They frequently say that they're sorry. But domestic violence claims the lives of 2 women a week in the UK. On average, victims live with domestic violence for 2.5 years before they get help. The average woman will be assaulted 35 times before she'll report it to the police. 1 in 4 women will have experienced this in their lifetime, 8% in any given year. It's most common in young women aged between 16 and 24, and half of victims are living with children who are less than 16 years old. Every study we have indicates that this problem is widespread. And that message again, abuse can take many forms, and not all violence is physical. The impact on children is profound. Children exposed to violence in their family show the same pattern of activity in their brains as soldiers exposed to combat. 1 in 5 children have been exposed to domestic abuse. When a woman is abused, the children are more likely to experience abuse. A child who witnesses violence in their own home is 15 times more likely to later become a victim themselves. Boys witnessing domestic violence are twice as likely to become perpetrators later on. Children are affected in many ways. They may get caught in the crossfire, protecting their mum, and sustain physical injuries. It can affect their emotional health with depression, anxiety, sleeping and eating disorders, and self-harm all being more common. It can markedly affect their behaviour with difficulties with concentration, heightened aggression, early sexualisation or drug activity all being recognised associations. This has a profound impact on the health and educational achievement of affected children. So, witnessing or experiencing domestic abuse is a form of child abuse, and it's a factor in 60% of serious case reviews. The link between domestic abuse and child abuse is so strong that it's usual practice to refer children to social services in cases where there are children dependent on the perpetrator or the victim. And this is the case even when the adult victim has capacity and doesn't want them to be referred. The children don't have to be present at the time of the incident triggering concern. The professional making the referral is acting as an advocate for the child, placing their interests first. Our role is incredibly important. The NHS is likely to feel less stigmatising to victims than the police or social services, so we're in a unique position to help. We can't assume that someone else is going to do it, because often no one else knows. We're really well placed to raise issues that can lead to disclosure. It's essential that people feel they're treated with respect and dignity, because they often feel ashamed, humiliated, frightened, guilty. The slightest hint of scepticism will drive them back to isolation and violence. It's so important that we listen. Don't be judgmental. Don't think you don't want to get involved in something so personal. Instead, think, if I talk about this, it helps end the stigma and lets victims know they're not alone, that there is help out there. It's never the victim's fault. So many women say afterwards, I just wish I'd been asked. And it's our role to be sensitive to cues, to be curiously looking out for concerns. Women often hope that someone will realise something is wrong. We need to encourage the whole practice team to be vigilant, to flag up even soft concerns. It's essential that we challenge the belief that domestic violence is not serious, or that it's a private matter. No one should assume that if the potential victim denies that anything is wrong, that means it's not happening. We need to seek to empower the victim to make informed choices and decisions. We should respect their confidentiality, but it's important to be clear about the limitation of that if a child is at risk. We need to create an environment which encourages disclosure. Try and see her away from her partner and children. In these situations, safety is paramount for both the victim, their children, and also for us. If there's a potentially violent situation, it's essential that we should cooperate with other agencies. A multi-agency partnership is the most effective way to manage domestic abuse. MARAC is a vital tool in assessing safety, and it moves the responsibility from the victim to a broad group of agencies. Why might a woman say everything's fine? She might be afraid we won't be sympathetic. She might be afraid that disclosure will make the violence worse. She might be ashamed or afraid that she won't be believed. She might well be terrified that her children will be taken into care. There are lots of questions we can ask that can be helpful. Do you ever feel frightened of your partner or other people in the home? Does he ever lose his temper? What does he do when that happens? Has he ever broken things that you care about or threatened you or the children? Has he ever forced sex on you or made you have sex in a way that you don't want? Your partner seems very concerned about you. Sometimes people react like that when they feel guilty. Does he ever use drugs or alcohol excessively? How does he behave after he's done that? A big question other people ask is, why doesn't she just leave? And the horrifying answer is that victims know it's incredibly dangerous to leave. The final step in domestic violence abuse pattern is to kill the victim. Because once she's left, he's got nothing left to lose. He might start stalking her, or manipulating her through the family court system, or taking financial control. Leaving is not easy. There was a story in the paper last week about a man who murdered his estranged wife with a hammer and stabbed their 11 and 6-year-old children to death before he killed himself. The paper reported that this man had previously served a jail sentence for a 2-day assault on his wife. Weeks before her death, she sent a text message to a family member saying she was terrified of him. Despite this, the coroner apparently said, "No one foresaw this was going to happen. There were no explicit threats." And a retired detective who carried out the review said, "What happened could not have been foreseen by friends, family, and professionals." And I'm not disputing that. I'm not saying anyone did anything wrong in this particular tragic case. But we need to wake up to the reality of this crime. It's common, it's pervasive, and it is deadly. But we can make a difference. We should be much more concerned about why men are abusing women than why women stay in abusive relationships. Society does tend to stereotype the victim. The subtext of why doesn't she leave is that it's somehow her fault and victims can be seen as self-destructive. But this could happen to any one of us, and there are hundreds and hundreds of stories of people who've escaped domestic violence relationships that show that these victims are just normal people who got unlucky because their lives are then completely turned around with support and help. So, it's never the victim's fault. No more of this. We have to break the silence. During this talk, several women have been the victim of domestic violence. Abuse thrives in silence, shame, and secrecy. Shining a spotlight on abuse has the power to end it. Victims need every one of us to look out for the signs and recognise them. If we show abuse the light of day, we can end it. Bear in mind, a victim may only reach out for help once, so we have to believe them when they do.